Welcome back. Well, more confirmation from the Basic Education Minister, Angie Motshekga, yesterday that many children are dropping out of school during the pandemic, and when schools are only in class every second day or every second week, which is most government high schools at the moment. The department also confirming one of the big problems is that even children who are younger and for whom going to school is actually compulsory by law, they have to be in class, some of them are dropping out. Merle Mansfiled is the program director at the Zero Dropout Campaign. Merle, good afternoon to you. We've been talking about this problem for about a year. That's when you first started raising the red flag here. In terms of the pandemic, is there now more evidence that even more children are dropping out of school than were a year ago?
Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to your viewers. Indeed, we are seeing that the impact the pandemic has had on households and on the economic circumstances of households has definitely impacted learners' ability to hold their connection to school. So the priorities in terms of returning to school or school attendance seems to not be as high for many households who are navigating other crises. We also see that the impact that the disruptions of school closures have had on learner engagement, which is really the kind of pre-process before a learner drops out of school, has been quite drastic. So most learners who were already having quite a tenuous relationship with school, and the engagement levels with school not being high, having to now also navigate the pandemic, missing school, having rotational timetables, not having access to content or teachers, feeling isolated. All of those impacts heightening disengagement to a level where learners just aren't returning to school, or where they're having very poor attendance, which is kind of a prerequisite to drop out. And so we are seeing that phenomena across the globe, in fact, but definitely within South Africa as well.
I would imagine part of it might be school meals. I mean, if there was ever an incentive for children to go to school, it would be school meals. That's been hugely disrupted over the last year.
Absolutely. I think, school meals is one of the protective factors that have been proven in the research to encourage learner attendance. But I think additionally, schools serve in South Africa particularly as safe environments and as social connection spaces for learners and as protective factors within communities. And with school closures, and I think a lot of fear around the contraction of contracting the virus or being exposed to the virus, and poor communication mechanisms between schools and homes, we've seen how that's been quite difficult to keep sustained over time, even though DBE had made provisions to try and continue community feeding with the school feeding systems, that didn't necessarily materialize well in practice. And so all of those difficulties put strain on how children experience school and how households trust school, and that also impacts decisions around keeping children at home or sending them back to school. And very, very interestingly, our poorer households are experiencing the difficulties of the pandemic a lot worse, and also we are seeing less children from poorer households returning to school, as evidenced by the Newzroom data. And we're also seeing children from poorer households having larger kind of learning gaps during the disrupted periods because of the fact that many of them won't have access to materials or even spaces within their homes to be able, to engage with materials that they are provided with. And so, feeding as one of the protective factors, but I think a number of other support systems and social factors that schools provide for our children has been missing for the year.
And then younger children, and I mean younger children by law you have to be at school, but that seems to actually not be holding at the moment. Even younger children are dropping out. I mean, that tells us we have a serious crisis here.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things we need to be very clear on is that we have enrollment rates which show us how many kids are enrolled in school, and then we have attendance rates. And when we look at attendance rates, we're seeing that more and more children are not attending consistently, and more children are not attending school at all. And so that is, what we want to watch in terms of dropouts. Similarly, for our younger children in foundational phases, when we look at global research, we learn that when children are away from school for a long period of time, they can often forget concepts. So there's an element of forgetting, but when learning is also disrupted, there is an element of losing kind of grip or continuity on concepts or learning that was taking place at a particular time. And so with the rotational timetable that was instituted before, it made it quite difficult for younger children to keep up. I can imagine it might be, very overwhelming and quite frustrating to constantly be feeling like you're back at where you started when you go back to school. And so I think it's very useful that we have the new policy of all primary schools being open and returning back, even though we still have infrastructural challenges that's not making that possible in our most poor contexts, because we're having to maintain social distancing and COVID protocols.
I mean, I would presume the longer you're at school, the more you learn and the better it is, which means that the earlier you drop out, the worse it is. The less skills you learn, the less you're able to perhaps interact in a society which requires those skills. The point is the damage is far more severe the younger you drop out.
Absolutely, and this is why when we're talking about dropout, when we're talking the impact on education this pandemic has had, we're needing to think about 10 years from now, what we're going to be experiencing and seeing for these learners that have been in the foundation phase, reaching their final years in the FET phase, and if they do, and how they perform there. That's the first thing. And then the second thing, definitely research suggests that foundational skills are incredibly important to build on in future studies, but also has a very direct link to outcomes, well-being outcomes for young people. The way in which they are meaningfully able to navigate their lives, the skills and life skills that they're able to articulate, attain, and implement within their lives. The World Bank recently put out a study that suggests that learners who have had disruption in the foundational phase to this extent would most likely have earning potential which is 5% less than what the learners who have not had such extensive disruptions would have. And so we can see there's clear implications for our learners in the foundation phase, but for all of our school children at the moment.
There's so many different things to it. So let's just say, Merle, in a perfect world, these things happen, right? In a perfect world, everyone who needs a vaccination gets a vaccination by December. So come January next year, let's just say for argument's sake, the 15th of January, government says, right, everything is now going back to how it was. Everyone is going back to school for full-time, face-to-face teaching. It would not be enough just to do that, to get children who've dropped out to come back. What other interventions would it require to get them back? I presume quite a big intervention to get them back.
I think one of the things we need to be very clear on is that there are two key priorities. The one is to get kids back who haven't been attending school now, but I think also to really focus on the learners who have come back to school and ensure that we are building in protective factors that help them move through the system and through the next years of their schooling journey in a way that allows them to exit meaningfully. We've had a long periods of disruption. I think for this year, it was calculated that we lost about 54% of the school year in terms of time. But we now know that learning loss is actually calculated at 1.5 in terms of the time lost. So if you lose a week of schooling time, you've actually lost a week and a half of learning time. And so it will be very difficult for learners to catch up all the work that they have missed. And some analysts have said that it would be impossible. And so I think what needs to be done is that we need to have a very concerted effort to understand the wraparound support that learners, particularly in our poorer communities, are going to need to come back to school, hold their grip on school, making sure that we institutionalize the support, not just in the school space, but also in our homes, that we as parents and families and caregivers take hands with teachers and start really in terms of a community schooling effort, working together to provide that bridge for learners and the continuity that they're going to need to be able to do this moving forward, because it will be difficult, and really protecting the engagement levels of learners when they're experiencing school. So we're needing to make sure that the experience of school is as smooth as it can be within the current context, so that we are not further heightening their disengagement.
I mean, the problem is, Merle, as you well know, I mean, better than I do, the problem is actually getting worse right now as you and I talk to each other, because high schools are still going back, high school learners in government schools are still going to school only every second day or every second week. So, I mean, we're still losing half a week for every week.
Absolutely. So because rotational learning is still taking place, there are learners in our country that are still experiencing, severe disruptions to schooling. And I think some of the models that are kind of suggested or recommended at a global level speak to accelerated catch-up programs or accelerated learning programs, which uses intensive blocks of time to kind of focus on particular foundational skills or building skills within a curriculum. I think what's very difficult in the South African context is that because it's so diverse across the different spaces in the education sector, there is often not a one-size-fits-all rule that allows us to, implement this across the board. In fact, the inequality is so deep that it becomes quite difficult. For example, when we say all primary school learners come back, we see our quintile 1 to 3 schools, which are where we need our learners back. They're unable to do that. And so I think it's really something that needs to be thought about in a very nuanced way to ensure that we are providing systems of support that are contextually appropriate. So if accelerated learning programming can work within a particular space, that it is implemented and that we are able to support those learners in that way. If extending a school day, for example, in another space is more appropriate, that we are able to do that. I think we need that kind of flexibility, but we are going to need the innovation in terms of making sure that we can not just fulfill the curriculum outcomes or the curriculum timetable for that year, but we're able to ensure that we are trying to build back some of the losses that learners have experienced this year.
Well, there's a big conversation around the world, and you see it in different ways in different places, about how many days of the year a child should be at school. I think, if I remember correctly, Merle, I don't have it in front of me, we're about halfway. But some countries have a lot more school days a year than we do. There's nothing really that stops us from doing that, apart from the fact that I would imagine the unions and other role players would have a lot to say about it.
I think that it's extremely complex, and I think that one of the things we need to consider is also our people component within the spaces that we have and the capacity of people to be able to produce, this performance drive that we are measuring. There's more than one measure. So I think looking at the performance of how well a school does in terms of how kids are passing or if they're getting the material, and versus looking at the retention, keeping learners in school and making sure they're progressing through school in a meaningful way, those are sometimes can be in conflict with each other. And I think that actually our teachers have, come through in ways this year that have been phenomenal. I've seen in school spaces teachers just going way above and beyond to reach their learners and to be able to still stay connected with them. Similarly, school leaders being extremely innovative in finding ways to motivate their staff, while they're navigating the pandemic and keep things going in spaces that are extremely scarce in resources. And where people having to really work hard to do the basic or keep the basic minimums in place. And so I think those are inherited difficulties and inequalities that some of our schools sit with that we're needing to respond to, additionally to the kind of impacts of the pandemic. But again, it will be really important for us to complement all of the efforts of schools with community approaches. I believe that once volunteers, communities, and families get involved in supporting and strengthening the efforts of schools, we could see a much bigger kind of outcome and output in terms of what learners' capacity is and what they're able to do at the end of the day.
Merle Mansfiled, so much to do, isn't there? I really do appreciate it. Thank you from the Zero Dropout Campaign. I worry, I've got to tell you, that this is going to be one of the dominant dynamics over the next 10 years if we're not careful about how we deal with children who've lost so much of their teaching time. Well.